Every year, the NFL MVP award typically goes to a quarterback who we already knew was elite or a running back who had been dominating the league for half a decade now. The name etched onto the trophy almost never catches you off guard, but every few seasons a name pops up in the top 3 or 4 of the voting that makes you stop and ask what exactly is going on here. It isn't that these players aren't talented, because some of them were genuinely putting up legendary numbers during those specific windows. The thing is, when you look at where they were before the breakout and where they disappeared to afterwards, the outlier season typically doesn't make any sense. We're starting with 3 guys who seemingly came out of nowhere and shocked the entire league during their runner-up MVP seasons. First up is Don Majkowski in 1989, who finished second in MVP voting. If you're under 35 years old, there's a good chance you have no idea who this person is, which is exactly why he belongs on this list. Majkowski was a 10th round pick out of Virginia, and in the modern era of the draft, a guy like that probably wouldn't even get a phone call as an undrafted free agent. The Packers had been completely irrelevant for nearly 20 years at that point, managing only 4 winning seasons since Vince Lombardi left the building. Nobody expected a 10th round pick with a mullet to be the savior of the franchise, but in 1989, he was. He threw for over 4,300 yards and 27 touchdowns while leading the entire league in passing yards and attempts. The Magic Man nickname was well earned because he recorded 7 game-winning drives that year, essentially carrying the entire team on his back. The defining moment of that season came in November during a heated matchup against the Chicago Bears. Green Bay hadn't beat their rivals since 1984, and they found themselves down 6 points late in the fourth. Majkowski fired a touchdown pass across his body to Sterling Sharp, but the line judge immediately flagged him for being past the line of scrimmage. This was one of the first times in NFL history that a touchdown call was overturned by instant replay, and the ruling gave the Packers a 14-13 win. Green Bay finished the year at 10-6, and Majkowski ended up second in the MVP race behind Joe Montana. His career took a dark turn in 1990 when he tore his rotator cuff, and although he played 6 more seasons, he never found that magic again. By 1992, a young guy named Brett Favre had taken his job, leaving Majkowski with just 1 legendary season before his time in the spotlight ended. Next up is Barry Foster in 1992, who also finished second in MVP voting. Foster was a 5th round pick out of Arkansas who spent his first 2 seasons in Pittsburgh looking like he didn't belong in the league. His career almost ended before it truly started because of a massive blunder on a kickoff return in 1991, and the Pittsburgh fan base wasn't known for being patient with those kind of mistakes. Everything changed in 1992 under a new coach Bill Cowher when Foster suddenly locked in and became an unstoppable force. He rushed for 1,690 yards and 11 touchdowns, setting a Steelers single-season rushing record that has survived for over 30 years. That record stood firm through the eras of Jerome Bettis and Le'Veon Bell, and nobody has been able to touch it since. He finished second in the MVP race behind Steve Young, and actually ranked ahead of Emmitt Smith, which shows you how dominant he was. Unfortunately, his body couldn't handle the workload, and knee injuries forced him into retirement at only 26 years old. Finally, we have Jamal Lewis in 1998, who took 3rd place in the MVP voting. He was a 7th round pick out of Utah, and he's the ultimate example of a player who had no business reaching the heights he did. During that 1998 season, Anderson carried the ball 410 times for 1,846 yards and 14 TDs, while dragging the Atlanta Falcons all the way to the Super Bowl. The Dirty Bird touchdown became the cultural face of the NFL for that year, and he finished just behind Terrell Davis and Randall Cunningham for the league's top honor. The following season, he tore his ACL early in the year, and the explosion that made him special never really came back. These 3 players all had seasons where the production was elite and the impact was undeniable, but their bodies simply ran out of runway before they could turn those moments into a great career. The first group of players we just talked about basically came out of thin air, but this next crew is a little bit different. These players had already established themselves in the league, and some had proven that they belonged, but they eventually hit one specific season where everything just clicked and their production jumped to a completely different level. Take Kordell Stewart in 2001, for example, when he finished 4th in the MVP race. To really get why this season was such a big deal, you have to look at what his career looked like leading up to that point. He showed up in Pittsburgh back in 1995 as Slash, and the team used him as a receiver, a runner, and a QB all at once. The problem was that being a jack of all trades made it easy for critics to claim he wasn't actually good enough to master any single position, and they were right. By the time 1998 rolled around, he got benched, and the Pittsburgh media started tearing him apart over his leadership and his ability to read a defense. Most of the league had written him off as a great athlete who just couldn't run a standard offense, but then 01 changed everything. He stopped with the gadget plays and focused on being a traditional pocket passer, throwing for 3,109 yards and adding 500 more on the ground to keep defenses honest. Pittsburgh finished with a 13-3 record, which was the best in the AFC, and Stewart found himself right behind legends like Kurt Warner and Marshall Faulk in the MVP voting. It was a massive redemption story that the media absolutely loved, yet the window didn't stay open for long. Just 1 year later, Bill Cowher benched him mid-season for Tommy Maddox, meaning that elite peak only lasted about 14 months before it was over. Then you have Tiki Barber in 05, who finished 4th in the voting as well, though his career path moved in the opposite direction of almost everyone else on this list. During his early years with the Giants, people didn't talk about his talent as much as they talked about his fumbling problem. He put the ball on the ground so often that the front office seriously considered replacing him, but he finally fixed his grip around 02 and started turning into a weapon. By 2005, he wasn't just a reliable back, he was arguably the most dangerous offensive player in the entire NFC. He put up 1,860 yards and another 500 receiving, leading the NFL in total yards from scrimmage. He ended up finishing behind Shaun Alexander and Peyton Manning in a year that was absolutely loaded with talent in the MVP race. What makes Tiki's story so weird is that his peak didn't end because of an injury or a bad scheme fit. He simply decided to retire after the 2006 season while he was still playing at an elite level, making him one of the few players to ever walk away from the top on his own terms, and then the Giants won the Super Bowl the next year. DeMarco Murray's 2014 season is another one that still feels a bit confusing when you look back at the numbers. Before that year, Murray was a solid starter for Dallas who could give you 1,100 yards if he stayed healthy, but he wasn't exactly a superstar. Everything changed in 2014 when that Cowboys offensive line became a historic unit, and DeMarco turned into the engine that powered the best rushing attack in the league. He handled a massive workload with 392 carries for 1,845 yards and 13 touchdowns, which earned him the Offensive Player of the Year award and 3rd place in MVP voting. He was basically a cheat code during the first 2 months of the season, hitting the 100-yard mark in 8 straight games to start the year. However, as soon as he signed a massive contract with Philadelphia the following offseason, the wheels fell off the wagon. The Eagles didn't have the same dominant line or the right scheme for his style, and he struggled through a 700-yard season before falling out of the league entirely by age 29. People often argue that his 2014 success was just a product of the system, but even if that's true, the games from that season show a guy who was unstoppable for one perfect year. The next 2 players both had career-defining moments in 2008, and they both also came from places where nobody expected them to succeed. Chad Pennington finishing 2nd in the MVP race is a story that sounds like it was written for a movie. The Jets cut him in the summer of 2008, just 1 day before the season started, and he signed with the Miami Dolphins literally 24 hours later. You have to remember that Miami was coming off a miserable 1-15 season, so expectations were non-existent. Pennington actually lost his first game against his old team, but he found his rhythm quickly and started carving up defenses with incredible efficiency. By the end of the year, he was completing over 67% of his passes and led the Dolphins to an 11-5 record and an AFC East title. He won Comeback Player of the Year and pushed Peyton Manning for the MVP, which was a shock to everyone who thought that his arm was shot. He never had a big arm to begin with, and multiple shoulder surgeries had only made things worse, but he won with pure intelligence and a wildcat formation that caught the rest of the league off guard. The season ended with him beating the Jets to clinch the division, which is the kind of perfect ending that usually only happens in fiction. He only played 1 more full year before injuries forced him to retire, essentially packing an entire career's worth of drama into one incredible season. In that same 2008 season, Michael Turner was busy putting up a 3rd place MVP finish of his own. Turner had spent 4 long years in San Diego sitting on the bench behind LaDainian Tomlinson, and he only got a single start during that entire time. Most teams wouldn't gamble on a backup with that little experience, but Atlanta saw something they liked and gave him a massive $34 million contract. People wondered if he could actually handle being a lead back after all these years of a limited workload, but he answered those doubts immediately by racking up nearly 1,700 yards and 17 touchdowns. That touchdown total is really what stands out because hitting 17 scores on the ground is incredibly rare. The Falcons went from a 4-win team to an 11-win team overnight, and Turner was a physical force that made their offense work. While he remained a productive player for a few more seasons, he never quite recaptured that same explosive energy from 08. The mileage eventually caught up to him, and as defenses figured out how to slow him down, that MVP level window slammed shut. These 2 players took completely different paths to get to the same spot in 2008. Neither one of them was supposed to be the face of the league that year, but for 12 months, they both made it impossible to talk about the MVP conversation without mentioning their names. Now we get to the guys who, where they had their peak seasons, actually wasn't a surprise if you were watching their career all along, but it also goes to show you that a championship window can shut at any moment in time. By the time Carson Palmer arrived in Arizona for the 2015 season, most fans had already filed him under the cautionary tale category. He had survived a torn ACL in the 05 playoffs with Cincinnati and a second knee injury later on, followed by a trade to Oakland where he played decent but mostly unspectacular football for 2 years. Palmer was 35 years old in 2015, which is usually the age where a quarterback is just trying to manage his production rather than expanding it. However, playing under Bruce Arians in that no risk it, no biscuit offensive scheme, he aired it out for 4,671 yards and 35 touchdowns with only 11 interceptions. The Cardinals finished 13-3 and looked like one of the best teams in the league, which led Palmer to finishing third in MVP voting behind Cam Newton and Tom Brady. That year, he was simply edged out by one of the greatest individual seasons in NFL history from Cam, and a Brady performance that people often forget was actually elite. His best game that year came against the Packers in the playoffs, but then they got blown out by the Panthers in the NFC Championship game, ending Arizona's Super Bowl run. That loss closed the book on his prime, as he played a few more seasons before getting hurt again and retiring in 2018. The 2015 season was a version of Carson Palmer everyone had been waiting for since he was the first overall pick in 2003, but it showed up 12 years late and only lasted about 5 months. The 2016 Raiders are one of the most fun teams to look back on in the modern NFL history, and Derek Carr was the engine behind that operation. He threw for 3,937 yards with 28 touchdowns and only 6 interceptions while leading 7 game-winning drives, which made him look like a legitimate top 5 QB at just 25 years old. Oakland went 12-3 in the games he started, and they looked like a real threat to win it all. Derek finished third in MVP voting behind Matt Ryan and Tom Brady, though in almost any other season, those numbers would have put him right up there at the top of the ballot. The Raiders had Khalil Mack terrorizing offenses and a solid offensive line protecting Carr, creating a culture that felt like it was finally turning a corner after more than a decade of losing seasons. Then came Christmas Eve, where the division was already clinched and Oakland was leading in the fourth quarter of a game that didn't really matter for the standings. Derek took a sack and broke his fibula, forcing him to miss a playoff game where Connor Cook had to start against a Houston defense featuring J.J. Watt, who we'll get to a little bit later, and Jadeveon Clowney. While Carr did return in 2017, he never quite reached the same level of play again, and there's a strong argument that the injury changed the entire trajectory of the franchise. Through 13 games in 2017, Carson Wentz had 33 touchdowns and only 7 interceptions, while leading the Eagles to an 11-2 record as the clear best team in football. He wasn't just a candidate in the MVP conversation, he was the runaway frontrunner to the point where the race didn't even feel like a competition anymore. That changed in Week 14 against the Rams when he dove for a touchdown and got hit on the way down, resulting in a torn ACL that ended his season. He still finished third in the MVP voting behind Tom Brady and Todd Gurley, despite missing the final 3 games of the regular season, and the entire playoff run because those first 13 games were just that dominant. Nick Foles took over the offense and won the Super Bowl to become a Philly legend overnight, while Carson had to watch the celebration from the sideline in a knee brace and crutches. What happened to his career after that point is a much longer story, but the decline starts right here, with a season that looked like the start of a generational career ending on a low hit in Los Angeles. All 3 of these QBs had their momentum ripped away by physical setbacks, whether it was Palmer's age, Carr's leg, or the ACL for Wentz. The production and the ceiling were both very real until they suddenly weren't there anymore. The last 2 players on this list didn't just almost win the MVP, they almost flipped the entire script on how the entire award is given out. These weren't just guys who snuck into the top 5 during a lucky year, they were legitimate threats to take the trophy away from a QB, which is something that almost never happens in the modern era. When J.J. Watt finished second in the MVP voting in 2014, he managed to pull in 13 first-place votes. To put that into perspective, Lawrence Taylor was the last defensive player to actually win the award back in 1986, and no defender had ever come close to that kind of voting share in the 30 years since. JJ earned more MVP support that year than any other defensive player in that entire 3-decade stretch. Aaron Rodgers ended up winning the award, and the final tally wasn't particularly close, but the fact that a defensive lineman was pulling double-digit votes says everything you need to know about how Watt was playing. The production from that season was honestly absurd, as he racked up 20.5 sacks along with 29 tackles for loss and 4 forced fumbles. He became the first ever unanimous Defensive Player of the Year winner, and the only reason he even qualifies for a list about random MVP finalists is that his position makes a whole run seem impossible on paper. If you go back and watch the games from that season, the randomness disappears because he was dominating everywhere on the field. He lined up inside, outside, and even at tight end in the red zone where he caught 3 touchdown passes. The Houston coaching staff basically pointed him at a problem and let him go solve it. Offensive coordinators were trying to build entire game plans just to keep him away from the football, but he was still figuring out ways to get to the quarterback. The eye test was so overwhelming that you could be watching a random game in October and have to stop what you were doing, league's biggest award, to someone on the defensive side of the ball. Wide receivers almost never finish high in the MVP voting because of the way the award is structured. Since quarterbacks control the ball and running backs get a high volume of touches, everyone else is considered too dependent on their teammates to get credit for the whole team's success. Cooper Kupp broke that mold in 2021 when he caught 145 passes for 1,947 yards and 16 touchdowns. He won the receiving triple crown by leading the league in all three major categories and finished third in MVP voting behind Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady. For about 4 months, the connection between Matt Stafford and Cooper Kupp was the most reliable thing in the sport. Stafford had just arrived from Detroit and immediately found a target he could trust in any coverage or any situation regardless of the down and distance. The Rams went on to win the Super Bowl that year, and Cooper Kupp took home the Super Bowl MVP and Offensive Player of the Year awards as well. He basically swept every trophy he was eligible for except for the one that historically belongs to quarterbacks. Finishing third in that race during a season where most receivers would be happy to get a single vote is a massive achievement. Together, Watt and Kupp represent the absolute ceiling for what a non-QB can do in the MVP race. And even with these historic seasons, they still couldn't quite cross the finish line. Every single one of these seasons happened because a specific set of circumstances aligned at the exact same time. The team was winning, which meant the individual numbers carried real weight, and the role fit so perfectly that the production stayed sustainable for long enough to matter. Most importantly, the player was operating at a level where you couldn't explain the output by looking at the circumstances alone. A lot of people want to reduce guys like DeMarco Murray to the offensive line or Barry Foster to Bill Cowher's system, but that wasn't it. The blocking in this scheme definitely helped, but bad players are stuck in good systems every single year and they never finish high in MVP voting. The other thing worth sitting with is how the MVP vote itself shapes the story we tell. Because the voting structure favored quarterbacks, it makes it nearly impossible for non-skill positions to win. Some of these seasons get permanently undersold by history. JJ Watt in 2014 might have been the most dominant individual performance of that entire decade, yet he still didn't win the award. Cooper Kupp put up receiving numbers in 2021 that would have won in almost any other year, but he still finished third. These seasons exist in a specific space in NFL history, where they're too good to ignore, but too brief to define a whole career. So there you have it. Thanks for watching. Watch this next video if you haven't already, and subscribe if you're new.